Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics315. Today I am speaking with Professor Peter Kreeft. He's the professor of philosophy at Boston College and at the King's College in New York City. In addition to being a popular speaker, he is also a prolific author of over 63 books, including The Handbook of Christian Apologetics, Socratic Logic, and A Refutation of Moral Relativism. The purpose of this interview is to gain some insights from Professor Kreeft's experience defending the faith and ask him for his advice for those seeking to be better thinkers, communicators, and apologists. Thanks for joining me today, Professor Kreeft.
You're very welcome.
Would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and what your current work is?
Well, I was born on the planet Mars. I'm just visiting this Earth. It's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live here. No, I'm only kidding. I'm 74 years old. I was born in New Jersey, raised a Dutch Calvinist. I still respect very much my background. I became a Roman Catholic at Calvin College, of all places, by reading my way into the church through the Church Fathers. I think one of the most important things I do with my apologetics is build bridges between Protestants and Catholics in the spirit of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity.
You mentioned the different thinkers that have influenced you. Throughout your career, what do you think are the authors or thinkers that have been most influential to your own work?
Nothing terribly original here. In philosophy, certainly Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas, and also Pascal and Kierkegaard. In literature, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, obviously Dante. And my personal favorite is C.S. Lewis. I keep finding him inhabiting different portions of my brain all the time. and G.K. Chesterton, who was an absolute genius.
Well, then let's kind of move on and talk about different roles of philosophy to theology. And some people might say that philosophy is either something Christians should avoid, or that it's a distraction, or maybe even a detriment to theology in some way. What's your personal view on that?
Well, throughout the Middle Ages, there were these three different opinions, and the main line, as typified by Augustine and Aquinas, was always that philosophy was a noble human enterprise to be used by the Christian, just as anything else that is natural and human could be used. But instead of philosophy reinterpreting Christianity, Christianity should reinterpret philosophy. The two opposite extremes to that middle position would be that philosophy is a dangerous thing intrinsically, and you're probably going to lose your faith if you're too smart. Or secondly, that philosophy is superior to religion, and religion has to bow to it and conform to it.
So you definitely take that middle way of philosophy being as they would say, the handmaiden to theology.
You know, I think that started in the Gospels already, when John began his Gospel by saying, in the beginning was the Logos, and then identified the Logos with Christ. That was perhaps the most important philosophical word in the Greek vocabulary. The Logos meant the ultimate truth, the meaning of all things. So he's identifying that with Christ. So he's relating Christ to the search of the philosophers in the same way that Matthew related Christ to the Jewish search for the Messiah, the fulfillment.
Well, thinking about philosophy as a set of tools, if you will, what sort of benefit do you think that philosophical training, maybe as a tool set for thinking and exploring ideas, has to defending the Christian faith?
Well, I think that's secondary. Mathematics is also a tool for physics, but it has its own integrity. And philosophy is, of course, usable as a tool for anything, not just apologetics, but philosophy of science, philosophy of education, philosophy of music, anything. But the main purpose of philosophy, as traditionally conceived, is to reflect on the big questions of human life. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? What is good and evil? What is life? What is death? What is God? So philosophy is not primarily a tool, but primarily a science in the ancient, old, long, broad sense of the word, rather than the modern, short, narrow sense of the word. And everybody is really a philosopher, because the questions philosophy asks, as distinct from the questions science asks, are not specialized questions. They're questions that everybody asks. They're natural human questions.
In regards to logic, you're one author who is big on logic, which is one of the things I really like. You've written a great logic textbook called Socratic Logic. So why should Christians learn logic?
Logic, as distinct from philosophy, is primarily a tool. And all the great philosophers, whether they learned logic formally or not, were good at it. Logic is simply the way of naturally organizing and clarifying our thinking. But there are two logics today. Ever since the beginning of the 20th century, mathematical logic or symbolic logic, which is basically the logic of the sciences, has displaced traditional classical Aristotelian logic, which is naturally the logic of the humanities or logic of ordinary language. I have never heard anyone but philosophers ever argue in symbolic logic. So I definitely prefer Aristotelian logic for ordinary purposes, but almost all the logic textbooks are symbolic logic, partly because of the prestige of science and partly because of its much greater accuracy. It's more mathematical. So I think the popularity of my book stems from the fact that it's logic as a human instrument rather than logic as advanced mathematical discipline.
Do you think that when people get into logic, why do you think that they seem to gravitate naturally to studying fallacies?
Oh, well, because of original sin. We like to prove that we're smarter than the other guy, and the other guy is an nincompoop. So if we can find fallacies in his work, we rejoice. That's a sort of an offensive logic. I think the more important kind is a defensive logic, defending what you believe by positive arguments rather than just finding fallacies in somebody else's.
Mm-hmm. Some of the books I've read in the subject, the author will tend to emphasize not being a logic police, whereas sometimes you can spot an amateur because they're just all they do is talk about the fallacies they see. Do you think that there's a place for a certain sort of etiquette when you're evaluating arguments, that you're not just calling foul at every point?
Yes, and most beginners, like most young children, don't have much etiquette. And they realize for the first time that things are highly questionable and it's fairly easy to refute almost anything, and therefore they become skeptics. Or if not themselves, then their students become skeptics because they see that they too can find fallacies almost everywhere.
Well, your book is called Socratic Logic, and why do you call it that, and what would you say that makes it different?
Because Socrates was the first person in the history of the world to clearly know what a good logical argument was and to use it. He never reflected on it. He never wrote a logic textbook. Aristotle did that for the first time. But I know of no better way to introduce philosophy than have students read the Socratic dialogues. It's a perfect example. First of all, Socrates comes through as a human character, so there's dramatic interest, and there's good psychology. Plato is a great literary talent as well as logical talent. Secondly, the questions are natural human questions, usually about values and about the meaning of life, happiness, good and evil, virtue and vice, meaning of death, questions that people are naturally interested in. Thirdly, Socrates has a gentleness and an irony about him. And he tries to, work like an old schoolmaster with young children, leading them from their fallacies to finding the truth. So the first half of the dialogue is the way Socrates, instead of just bashing the student on the head with a logic textbook, makes him see himself that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And then he gently leads him to see what he's talking about. So it's a very respectful kind of cooperative art, like surgery, where the surgeon uses the natural functions of the body to repair themselves, or farming, where the farmer doesn't create a new product like the architect building a building, but helps the earth to bring forth its natural product.
You're kind of describing there the Socratic style, and maybe people have heard of a Socratic method. How do you think that it can be applied to apologetic dialogue, and what would that look like, do you think, practically?
Well, there's really two meanings to Socratic Method. One is the thing that I just talked about, how he treats his dialogue partner. What are the rules of conversing logically? The other part of it is the philosophical assumption about how we find truth. And that's even more important. Socrates believes that it is, number one, very difficult, more difficult than we think, and number two, quite possible, and number three, terribly important to find truth. And most philosophers nowadays, I think, would not agree with all three of those statements. The Socratic method of finding truth is basically a commonsensical epistemology or theory of knowledge that begins with experience, rises by abstraction and induction to general principles, and then deduces from those general principles how it applies to concrete examples in ordinary experience again. So he's using both the senses and the mind, both the lower and higher kinds of knowing, and he's using both induction and deduction, going up and going down, and he's also using uncertainties and certainties, because when you start with experience and make generalizations, that's only probable, that's not certain. And when you start with the principle and apply it to a particular case, that's deductive argument, and that's certain. So Socrates is neither a skeptic who thinks that probability is all we have, nor a dogmatist who thinks that certainty is all we have. So he's between the two extremes on almost every issue.
Well, I also like kind of what I envision when you're talking about that is sort of the picture in my mind of instead of having an opponent that you're trying to persuade, that you're coming alongside and walking with the person that you're on this quest for truth with, more of a disarming manner, if you will.
It's very much like intellectual psychoanalysis, which is why he asks questions all the time.
And I suppose you definitely need to know where you're going in order to ask the right questions then.
Right. But it's not like a lawyer's leading questions in court in order to prove a foregone conclusion. It's a genuine, open-minded search for truth. Mm-hmm. He knows where he's going, but that doesn't mean that it's all mechanical and gimmicky. He really cares of the soul. He cares about the other person's soul, and he wants to purify it and cleanse it. He believes that intellectual error and moral error always go together. So there's always a moral dimension to the logic for Socrates, too.
From your perspective, how do you think that, say, the Christian apologist who's interacting with someone can discern whether or not the person that they're speaking with is really concerned about truth, or how can you help steer the conversation towards, hey, we're looking for truth, we're not, trying to challenge one another or defeat one another's argument?
I don't know of any one gimmick that works for all kinds of people. No one-size-fits-all T-shirt. You just have to listen to the other person and understand where he's at, where he's coming from, what his problems are, and deal with them on a kind of ad hoc basis. That's part of the Socratic method. The teacher is, first of all, the listener, the student, who asks questions of the other, and the other informs him. For instance, Kierkegaard has a great example of this in his last book, I think it is, A Point of View for My Work as an Author, where he interprets all of the many works that he has written, not all of them were apparently religious, as having this ultimate religious purpose of a kind of a care for the soul. He says, take a person who is very angry, unjustifiably and illogically. How do you deal with them? How can Socratic method work for difficult people? Well, if you want to teach him, you have to, first of all, listen to him and thus become the learner. So let him lecture you. Let him talk to you. Just ask him why he's angry, what he thinks happened, and what are his reasons. And then once that's out, then that's sort of on the table, common between you, and you can look at it and you can analyze it, because that's his mind, and he's going to be interested in that. It's not your mind that you're imposing upon him, which he's going to resist, but it's his own mind. And with the right help, he will see his way through the tangle that he's in and emerge into some sort of light. And then you have helped him rather than fought against him.
much of our audience for this interview is going to be those wanting to learn how to defend the faith better. And you've spoken to audiences all over the U.S. and, of course, have had to deal with all kinds of audience questions. And some are tough or hostile. Some are probably extremely challenging. So what sort of things have you learned to put into practice as you are asked tough questions?
Well, I think from my own experience, I'd say the two most important and powerful and effective things to know are not methods. They're presuppositions. One is that all truth is God's truth. And if you're defending that, you're always going to win, even if you seem to lose. Even if your opponent seems not to listen to you and seems to defeat you, you will plant doubts in his mind, and he'll go home and maybe confess to himself and God that he may be wrong, even though he won't confess that to you. So that's your job, to stand in the light, not to win, but to fight for light rather than darkness, so that a kindergartner can really defeat a great atheist in debate, even though the audience wouldn't think so, simply because he speaks the truth and the atheist doesn't. That's one thing. The other thing is that you're doing this for a certain motive, and if the motive is simply personal and egotistical, then you're not going to get divine help. And if the motive has nothing to do with you or your victory, but simply to help that other person find his way to God, to make a little hole for the divine light to get into his soul, God's going to respect that motive, and he's going to give you help. It probably is not going to be a lightning bolt from heaven. It may not even be a knocking down, dragging out argument that your opponent can't refute, but it'll be something better than that. It'll be what the opponent needs. I would apply Romans 8:28 to that situation. All things work together for good to those who love God. So if you're doing this for the love of God, God will arrange for what you say to work for good.
Well, right along that same line, some questions I've noticed there, and I'm sure you've encountered, they're more than questions. They're statements, or they're loaded somehow. They're intended maybe to trap the speaker or refute him. But I've noticed from listening to some of your lectures that your style, in my view, is quite disarming, and you're able to flow well with different challenges and use humor or stories to kind of make things flow along. So my question in this would be, is there a point that you make in your own mind to try to discern what the true question is that's being asked, and how you might try to calm hostility?
That's a very important distinction, what's in his mouth and what's in his heart. If you look at how Jesus handled his interrogators, you'll find that he rarely directly answered a question in the words in which it was phrased. And it might seem at first as if he's dodging the question, but he's not. It's the questioner who's dodging the real question. Example, the interview with Nicodemus in John 3. Nicodemus comes with some praise. We know you're a great teacher, Rabbi, come from God. No one can do miracles like this unless they were from God. And Jesus cuts through all the baloney and answers the real question that was on his mind when he says, truly, truly, I say to you, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven without being born again. Nicodemus wonders, is this the Messiah? If so, he's going to enter the kingdom of heaven, or establish the kingdom of heaven, and I want to enter it. How do I do it? But he didn't want to start there. But Jesus knew that was the real question. Another example, in John 8, should we stone the prostitute or not? Mosaic law commanded it, Roman law forbade it. He's going to get in trouble with one of the two sides, no matter what he says. So instead of answering the question directly, he says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, which answered the real question, the question of where their hearts were at. So if you can see the real question behind the question, if you can address the person inside rather than just the one that's moving their lips, well, that's going to do something. But just answering words is not usually going to do anything, just more words. Like in the end of Job, when Job has all these questions for God, and instead of answering them directly, God shows Job two things, who he is and who Job is. And Job says, now I know that I am the empty-headed man with empty-headed words, and I know who you are, and I'm satisfied. And Job's question, of course, is a question everybody has, the problem of evil. Why, if God loves us, does he let us suffer? Why doesn't he clean up all the injustice in the world? And that's a very important question, and it shouldn't be just dismissed. But the deeper question, I think, behind that question is, who is God and who am I? Augustine, in one of his soliloquies, imagines God asking him, what would you like to know? And Augustine says, just two things. Only two things, says God? Yeah. So I know these two things. I know everything I need to know. Who are you and who am I? I heard a preacher once say that God is trying to tell us just two things in the Bible, and you can summarize it in 4 words. Each of the two things has just 2 words. Thing number 1, I'm God. Thing number 2, you're not. That's a nice summary, and it's hard to remember. That second thing.
Now, I'm curious, as you were talking there about the problem of evil, do you think that that's the toughest question that you would be asked as a speaker?
Yes. And we can't answer it adequately simply because we're not God. So the answer there is kind of weak on reason and strong on faith. You just got to trust him. There is indeed evidence against God. It's not conclusive evidence, but it's evidence. If we didn't live in a world that tested our faith that way, if we didn't have intellectual temptations, if everything seemed orderly, our faith would be weak. There would be nothing to push up against. We wouldn't get muscles.
I think that's really helpful, especially for those who they're giving talks and they're receiving these sorts of questions, that it's not about having the right answer, but I like what you said back there about having the right heart towards the person you're speaking with, the right motive in order to minister to them and lead them to Christ.
Yeah, and heart is not just the momentary feelings. It's deeper than that. It's a will. If God came to you and said, what do you want to get out of this encounter? And you had to answer him honestly. The answer is going to come from your will. You might feel that you want to get out of this encounter, triumph or fame or something like that. But what you really want is to do his will and to help him minister to the soul. So the more self-forgetful you are in your heart, the easier it is. Because the more you think about yourself, the more you worry about yourself. According to the polls, the greatest fear of Americans is not death or even pain. It's public speaking.
Yeah.
People are afraid to be seen. They're so self-conscious.
Well, if we're talking about communication and what comes to mind for me is, those 3 elements of rhetoric, and in particular the element of character. It seems to me that as you're talking about there, where you say your heart is not this fleeting emotional element for the moment, but it is the, say, culmination of really who you are expressed in that moment, and that really who you are is going to make the difference between someone maybe being ministered to or feeling like you just evaded the question or had empty rhetoric.
Most of the preparation for doing apologetic dialogue, I think, has to be not so much between you and the books, but between you and God.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Augustine has a sermon called On the Pure Love of God, in which he says to his congregation, you probably think that it's impossible to obey the first and greatest commandment, to love God with your whole heart. But God doesn't command the impossible. So I'll bet most of you are living in obedience to that commandment, even though you may think that you're not. I'll prove it to you. He said, imagine God came to you and gave you this offer. He said, here's the deal. You can have anything you want. Nothing is impossible. Nothing is forbidden. Nothing is a sin. Nothing will make you feel guilty. There will be no punishment. You can have anything you want forever. Only one proviso. You will never see my face. Would you take that deal? If you answer no, look what you've done. You've given up the whole world and all possible worlds just for God. So that's what you most deeply want. Good for you.
When we're talking about prayer there, you mentioned how much preparation is really between you and God, and that kind of creating, or really is who you truly are, so to speak. How would you want to encourage people to develop their character through, whether it be through spiritual disciplines or through prayer or cultivating integrity, so that they can actually be good representatives of Christ?
I think you use the right word there, integrity or honesty. That's the first and maybe the most important thing of all, because if you don't stand in the light, you're not going to perform any operation at all. If you are totally honest with God, that will help your prayer and your life. We don't know what to pray for, so be honest and say, hey, God, I don't know what to pray for. Your will be done. And say that again in different words. I think God respects honesty enormously. And ordinary human beings do too.
Well, let's shift back to a different topic here. I wanted to ask you about the area of study, because you've written, I don't know what the exact count is, but it's over 60 books, and I'm sure that for every book you've written, you've read countless others in order to be able to write that book. So I'm interested in asking you what sort of advice you would have to Christian defenders to be lifelong learners.
Well, that's a good question. I wish I had a good answer. To a certain extent, you have to follow your heart. You can't say, this book is good for me, so even though I don't like it and I don't understand it, I will read it. If you don't like it, you probably won't understand it. It's not going to help you. But there is a certain set of books that everybody ought to read. They're called classics. And they're not just what some snobs say we determined everybody should read. They're what the history of all the people, from ordinary peasants to college professors, have found to give nourishment. Just as we find certain foods are nourishing, we find certain books are nourishing. We pass that down through tradition. So if almost everybody found that Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas are nourishing, then they'll nourish you. You might have to get them in beginner's doses. You might have to sometimes use secondary sources at first. For instance, Aristotle is kind of tough to read. His ethics is pretty easy, but the rest of his philosophy is kind of dull and difficult. So you might want to use a secondary source there. But most great writers like Plato and Augustine, you read them straight off, and you'll get something out of them. You won't understand everything, but you'll understand enough that that's better than reading secondary sources. And even a difficult writer like Aquinas, who's difficult in his vocabulary, but that's all. Once you get the vocabulary down, the technical terms, the logic is very simple. Most great writers like that, you can't really understand secondary sources, unless they're very, very good ones, without reading the writer himself. So instead of trying to understand Thomas through Thomists or Plato through Platonists, do the opposite. Understand the Platonists by reading Plato and the Thomists by reading Thomas. Until the 20th century, philosophers were meant to be read by ordinary people, not just by other philosophers.
And I'm sure that if you would have people read secondary sources, you might have a few of your own that you want to recommend. Is that right?
Well, yeah, because what I do is I throw these philosophers into Socratic dialogue with each other. Mm-hmm. Usually Socrates is the main character. So there's a lot of quotations from their books, and I think I've got the spirit of Plato's dialogues there. So it's the same game that Plato was playing, only I'm playing it on a little league field, and he played it in a major league stadium.
Well, I'm curious of all the books you've written, are there any that you're most proud of, or that you'd say, oh, here are the one or two that you'd have to read if you could only read a few, because they really represent what would be your core?
Well, the one that's the most wide-ranging and has the most of my heart in it, I guess, is my recent novel, An Ocean Full of Angels. Novels are funny things. You either love them or you don't. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if half the people who read it said, I don't get this at all. But maybe the other half will say, I love it. The book that is probably closest to my heart is called Heaven, the Heart's Deepest Longing, which is about exactly what the title says. And the book that I'd make everybody in the world read, if I could just make them read one book, would be Jesus Shock. Because that's about Jesus.
All right, well, I'll recommend them to our listeners in the links at the blog post. Now, I have a question along this line. And seeing you've written quite a bit, and as we've talked about, a lot of it's been in this Socratic style, what value do you see in encouraging apologists to be like C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or Chesterton or other great storytellers to convey the gospel message?
great value. Apprentice yourself to the great masters. That way of learning to do something you can't yet do, namely imitation, apprenticeship, has always been the one that most great minds recommend and the one that works the best, until our modern cult of individuality and creativity and originality, which doesn't work. Try to be original and you won't be. Just tell the truth as you see it, and you'll end up being original without even trying. So if your thing is storytelling, good. If your thing is logic, good. If your thing is history, good. Go where your strong card is. Play with your best pitch.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also have another book coming out this year, I understand. It's the Suma Philosophica. Would you mind telling our listeners about that one?
Yeah, there's another method that modern philosophers don't use much, and I don't know why. It's the method Thomas Aquinas used in the Suma Theologica, a method for summarizing and presenting very clearly the pros and cons of every major philosophical issue in a kind of an abbreviated debate format. And I think the method worked wonderfully to clarify things. So I took the 110 great philosophical questions and put them all in a Summa format and wrote a book called Suma Philosophica instead of Suma Theologica. It's not the last word, but I hope it's the first word, in the sense that I hope people will imitate my imitation and write more books in that method, just as they'll write more books in the Socratic Method.
Well, if our listeners want to find out more about you and your resources, where would you want to point them?
I've got a website, which I'm not responsible for. Dave Nevins set it up, and he's crackerjack at it. There's a lot of free downloads on it at peterkreeft.com.
Well, excellent. I've really enjoyed this interview. Professor Kreeft, thanks so much for joining me.
You're very welcome. It was a privilege. God bless you.
I've been speaking with Professor Peter Kreeft, Professor of Philosophy at Boston College and at the King's College in New York City. Find links to his resources at today's blog post at Apologetics315. In particular, I recommend his Handbook for Christian Apologetics and his logic textbook, Socratic Logic. If you've enjoyed today's interview, please share it with a friend via Facebook or Twitter, and remember to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, as podcast episodes are released a day in advance of their blog posting. While you're in iTunes, please leave a positive review. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics 315, and thanks for listening.